and welcome. I'm Anissa Nawe, kicking off a fresh season of In the Now. This week, Russia is not bombing ISIS because NATO says so. The refugee crisis is on the back burner, but the problem is worsening, and a 12-year-old black boy is suspended for staring at a white girl. You're In the Now. Russia is not bombing ISIS in Syria. In fact, it's bombing Syrian rebels to prop up Assad, the dictator. How do I know that? Because he said so.
I'm also concerned that Russia is not targeting ISIL, but instead attacking the Syrian opposition and civilians.
And they confirmed.
What's clearly emerging in day 2 of this Russian air campaign is that it is not just ISIS that's being targeted.
Why would the Russians strike here unless they were planning to have an intent to prop up Bashar al-Assad?
Instead, the Russians may have targeted the one group of folks, the one group of folks in Syria that America actually supports.
And these independent journalists verified it. Solid proof here, the researchers citing Google Maps and random Twitter users. And if you're still not convinced that fighting terrorists is just a cheap pretext by the Russians, check out this map. The yellow spots are where rebels are located, and that's where the Russians are bombing. According to who? A U.S. NGO and Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The organization founded in 2006 and run by a single man who's outside of Syria, located in Kazakhstan, actually. But he swears that his sources on the ground are credible and we should trust them. Hey, it's a small world. Joining me in the Now is Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Mr. Roth, thank you so much for finding time to be with us. The latest sentiment seems to be it's the rebels.
Thanks for having me.
It's the rebels who are bombing, who Russia is bombing, rather, not ISIS terrorists. And you particularly seem to be convinced that that's the case. Tell us why.
Well, obviously Russia's bombing a bit of each, but it's justifying this intervention by going after the Islamic State or ISIS. And, by all means, they're horrible. But in fact, if you look at whom Russia is actually bombing, it's mostly the other rebels. And so there's an issue of honesty there. But frankly, there's also a concern because, Russia shouldn't be sending the message that the safest place to be in opposition-held territory is ISIS territory. That would be utterly counterproductive.
Where is the information coming from that ISIS are not the main targets here, that it's other opposition that's being targeted?
Well, if you simply, chart on a map where the Russian bombs are falling, we know very well the areas held by ISIS and the areas held by other members of the armed opposition. And so it's pretty straightforward. Now, occasionally Russia is bombing ISIS areas. I don't want to pretend that that never happens. But certainly the preponderance of the efforts so far have been aimed at other members of the armed opposition, frankly, the ones that pose a more immediate threat to the Assad government. Because, one thing we've seen over the last couple of years is that there's relatively little fighting between Assad and ISIS. Assad is much more concerned with the other members of the armed opposition. And so, by all means, Russia can be propping up the Assad dictatorship. But a real concern we have is that Assad is fighting this war in an incredibly ugly way, targeting civilians in opposition-held areas. And I would hope that particularly as Russia gets more involved in this war, that it will stop the barrel bombing of civilians, that it will stop Assad's deliberate efforts to target civilians and to fire indiscriminately into civilian territories and neighborhoods.
If propping up Assad, like you say, was a priority for Russia and not fighting ISIS, why would they wait so long to start these strikes, wait for ISIS to make the gains that it has over the last year and a half or so?
Well, I think you'll have to ask Moscow that question. But, clearly Assad signaled in a speech a few weeks ago that he's in trouble. He's having real manpower shortages in his army. The opposition is gaining, and it's not simply ISIS, which is certainly making strides forward, but it's been mainly the other elements of the armed opposition that took Idlib province, for example, which was a big loss for the regime, which has been closing in around Damascus from the suburbs. And I think that, frankly, the Russian government just panicked and recognized that their ally was in trouble, so they went to his support. And that's certainly Russia's prerogative, but the issue really is don't prop up the war crimes that the Assad government is committing. Don't prop up its deliberate targeting of civilians. Because, in fact, that targeting of civilians is utterly counterproductive for the Assad regime's survival. It is the best recruiting tool that ISIS has. They can simply show the barrel bomb destruction in civilian neighborhoods, and people flock to ISIS or to other elements of the opposition. So I would hope that Russia, in its own interest, in the Assad government's interest, not to mention in the interest of the Syrian civilian people, that it would stop these attacks on the civilian population.
Speaking of attacks that you say on the civilian population, the Kunduz attack, which you, of course, condemned, in Twitter you mentioned that it was awful, but also in the same tweet pointed out that Assad attacks hospitals deliberately all the time. You've been speaking about targeting civilians. Why would Assad target civilians? Where's the logic here when the whole world is watching every step?
Yeah. It's an incredibly ugly war crime strategy, but it has epitomized the Assad government's approach to this war from nearly the outset. And I think his strategy is twofold. First, to try to depopulate the areas that the armed opposition has taken, so just to make it harder for the opposition to operate there. So they clearly want to kill enough civilians so the others flee. They also, frankly, want to send a message to other Syrian civilians. This is what will happen to you if the armed opposition takes your neighborhood. We will decimate your neighborhood. We will drop barrel bombs on it. That is, a blatant violation of the Geneva Conventions, a clear war crime, but that's the way the Assad government has been fighting this war. Now, Russia, to its credit, did join in a UN Security Council resolution in February 2014 condemning these barrel bomb attacks on the civilian population, but it has done nothing to enforce that resolution. So I hope that now that Russia is much more engaged in Syria, now that its military is deployed there, that it will use its enormous influence with this Assad government. It will use its influence as, frankly, the savior of that government to insist that Assad stop targeting Syrian civilians.
Mr. Roth, essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that Assad's strategy is to warn civilian areas that they will be bombed if they're kind of taken over by any kind of these rebels. So essentially warning them to get out. This is what you're saying. But some of
worse than warning. It's worse than warning them. He bombs them.
Where is the evidence? Because there's so many sides to this story. What kind of facts can we rely on saying that Assad is directly bombing, like you say, hospitals?
Oh, I mean, this is completely irrefutable. Human Rights Watch has issued numerous reports based on on-site investigations. Positions for Human Rights is actually, if you go to its website, it is documented, case after case after case of hospitals being attacked. I personally have spoken with many Syrian doctors who describe the helicopters circling overhead and dropping the barrel bomb, not just once, but repeatedly on the hospitals. It's gotten to the point where in opposition areas, there actually aren't even any more above-ground hospitals left. It's too dangerous. The hospitals have now had to go underground, but even then, the Assad government figures out where they are and drops barrel bombs on them. So, there is zero question that this has been the strategy. Russia can close its eyes to it, but let's recognize what's going on here. The Syrian people know this, and so far as they see Assad deliberately attacking civilians, they are going to flock to the opposition. So if Russia really wants to save the Syrian government, it should rein in its attacks on the civilian population, because that is the best recruitment tool the opposition has.
You have a very clear political position. You're very active on social media. The world, I think it's fair to say, knows what you think of President Assad and of President Putin. You don't hesitate to express it. How does that not influence the investigations of people that work for you, investigations of Human Rights Watch on the ground in Syria, like you say?
I don't have any political position. We never take positions on who should win an election, who's a good guy or bad guy in a political debate. Our focus is simply on sparing civilians in time of war. Our only politics are to uphold the Geneva Conventions. And so the instructions I give to the Human Rights Watch staff, which they are required to follow scrupulously, is that they call the facts as they are. Good facts, bad facts, it doesn't matter. I want to know what happened. We then assess that under the Geneva Conventions. And sadly, what we have seen is that the Assad government has ripped up the Geneva Conventions. It has flouted it in the most basic ways by making not only no efforts to spare civilians, but rather by indiscriminately bombing civilian neighborhoods and targeting civilians who happen to live in areas held by the armed opposition.
You're telling me that people that work for you or investigations that cooperate and coordinate with Human Rights Watch don't listen to your constant expressions of Assad being a dictator, of Russia doing the wrong thing. I mean, this has to affect, someone needs to be listening to your position. Maybe not on who should win an election, but they certainly know your point of view on Assad.
Mm-hmm. Look, I am critical, I'm very critical of ISIS. If you look at my tweets, I'm constantly criticizing ISIS. We criticize other members of the armed opposition. If you look at sort of Russia's behavior, I was in Ukraine recently. We criticize Ukrainian government abuses. We also criticize abuses by the Russian-backed rebels. We are scrupulously fair in any armed conflict. We look at both sides, we record the facts as they are, and we apply those facts under international humanitarian law or the Geneva Conventions. And in this case, I mean, there is zero question about this. ISIS is flouting the most basic norms of international law by beheading civilians and the like, by imposing its very rigid view of Islam on the people who happen to live under ISIS. There have been other abuses by rebels, which Human Rights Watch has reported on. But if you want to say what is the biggest killer of civilians today, sadly, no one holds a candle to Assad. He is responsible for the vast majority of civilian deaths. He's responsible for why so many refugees are fleeing Syria, not exclusively, but he's the biggest contributor.
I'm sorry, you say that no one holds a candle to Assad. I'm going to have to disagree with you this year, because if you look at the media coverage of Syria over the past 4 years or so, Assad has been, a lot of responsibility is put on Assad. If you look at organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, a lot of responsibility lays with Assad. And then governments across the world from the start, Assad must go. So how can you say that responsibility isn't put on him when the majority of it, I think it's fair to say, is in fact put on him?
No, that's my point. If you look at who is responsible for the bulk of the war crimes, there are war crimes on all sides, but the vast majority of civilians killed have been due to the Assad government. Anybody who's been counting up the figures will say that. Anybody who looks at the facts will say that. So this is not a partisan position. This is just looking at the facts. Now, Human Rights Watch doesn't say, Assad must go. We're saying Assad has to stop his war crime strategy.
So you're saying that Assad
targeting civilians.
is
and now that
worse
Russia is
than
there,
ISIS.
it has a duty to act as well.
You're saying that Assad...
I don't get into who's worse. They're both awful. They're both awful. Who has killed more civilians? Absolutely Assad. Who is worse? You can't say that. They're both terrible. They're both ripping up the most basic norms of international law. ISIS, through its beheadings, through its imposition of these severe restrictions on women and other people who were unfortunate enough to live under ISIS. Assad, by deliberately and indiscriminately targeting civilians who are unfortunate enough to live in areas held by the armed opposition. They are both behaving miserably. So don't get into a comparison game. They're both awful. And Russia has influence over Assad. It should be exercising that influence to get him to stop targeting Syrian civilians.
I'm not sure the Syrian people would agree with you. We do have to leave it there. So much appreciation, really, to you for coming on. Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, thanks so much for being in the Now.
Thank you.
Air support will be carried out without participating in ground operations.
40 years later, they are still haunted by the guilt.
All the choices I made, I had real problems accepting I did this. How can I be?
They come back to the battlefield to say sorry.
Our air war was vicious and brutal and horribly traumatizing to the Vietnamese people.
To remember fallen brothers.
I see you day and night, oh my brother.
And to bury their stories.
We are here together in part to allow the past to come back to us. Stories of so much pain and loss as my brothers carry get buried in our own minds and hearts and souls because the pain is so immense.
Vietnam, the stories that haunt soldiers' hearts.
Well, it's raining bombs.
Для начала воздушной операции выбрано очень удачно. Октябрь в Сирии в целом благоприятный для полетов месяц. Средняя скорость ветра 2-4 метра в секунду, а дожди бывают лишь раз в 10 дней. Причем самые интенсивные, до 18 миллиметров осадков, обычно наблюдаются как раз на севере, там, где идет операция российских ВВС.
This idea on a Russian TV channel clearly means someone's head was in the clouds this week. Next thing you know, the latest weather update for refugees. Calm seas and low tides in the Mediterranean, raining cats and dogs in Ukraine, divert tanks, bad timing for war, or clear skies above Pakistan. Awesome. Drones, get ready to drop. With Syria in the spotlight, everyone wants to have their say. Global powers, regional players, and religious figures. The only thing is, some of them sound just plain crazy. Europe is suffering one of the worst crises in decades, the refugee crisis. But don't worry, all is good.
Mit Klugheit und mit Augenmaß.
With cleverness, moderation and flexibility, we will achieve it.
But back home, away from Brussels, some Germans are feeling the bite. In one small town, some tenants are being evicted from their flats to make room for refugees. One woman who rented her apartment for 16 years is now being forced out to accommodate asylum seekers. Now, there must be a pretty good reason, you would think, but nope. It's just cheaper. The mayor of the town says building a housing unit for refugees would cost €300,000, while this solution will cost nothing. Well, that didn't go over well with some. Take a look at some reaction from social media. First of all, the legality of it was brought up. It's unconstitutional, wrote one user. Others, they were just plain furious. Some pointed out how this does not bode well for the country's migrant policy and its future. Especially since this year, 1 million refugees are expected to reach Germany. That is the final destination, of course. But what about countries in Eastern Europe, like Hungary? That's the main door to Europe. Joining us in the now is Hungarian MEP Gerd Schöpflin. Thank you for being with us. Hungary has seen almost 300,000 refugees enter the country this year alone. And the answer so far has been to build a very controversial fence. Will it stop the crisis?
Of course not, but it'll ease it. It'll solve the problem of registering the refugees who simply cross the frontier, known as the Green Frontier in Hungarian, and just pass through Hungary as if it didn't exist. They now go to the official crossing points and are properly registered, as is the requirement under the Dublin regulations.
Hungary, many say, was a key country in, of course, the breaking down of the Berlin Wall, of the so-called Iron Curtain, and then decades later, another wall being put up. A lot of criticism on this policy.
There's been no wall at all. It's a fence. There really is a difference in English. And Hungary has been obliged to do this. We're not happy about this. We're not jumping for joy that we've had to build this fence, but the fence has had to be built for the reason that I've already suggested. If you want to draw obscure parallels, misleading parallels between what happened in 1989 and what's happening in 2015, you can do so, but I don't think you should mislead your viewers.
It's not me drawing the parallel. It's critics who have publicly drawn the parallel, in fact. And a fence or a wall, things are being put up to keep refugees out, where a lot of European policies cause the circumstances of them having to flee. Is that not a fact?
Are you also putting this question to the British and the French? They've got one at Calais.
They do indeed, and that policy is also criticized.
Okay, fine. Well, criticize away, but then please answer the question. How does Hungary register refugees who refuse to be registered unless there is the fence which obliges them to go to the official crossing point? Otherwise, you're applying a double standard.
Well, I certainly can't solve Hungary's problems. What are other options than putting up sorts of blockades? Are there any?
The answer is no. I mean, this is discussed in Brussels, and the answer is reluctantly. There is no alternative to this. And let me repeat, Hungary is not happy about this, quite apart from anything else. It's cost a fair amount of money. But that's a secondary consideration. But there's simply no alternative to building this fence, most regrettable, but there it is.
Hundreds of thousands of failed asylum seekers will be deported from Europe within weeks under a secret plan that has been leaked to the Times newspaper this week. Why are officials afraid to discuss this publicly? Could there be public backlash for a policy like that? Why keep it in secret?
Well, I mean, I think it's confidential at this stage rather than secret. There is a clear distinction between those two concepts. My guess is that it's at the debating stage. What's probably been published in the Times is an early version of a draft paper, let's say a green paper or something along these lines. But I think that plans are afoot, certainly, to make the distinction, to differentiate refugees from economic migrants. And there's no reason why economic migrants should be staying in Europe, given that in Europe there's still a fairly high level of unemployment. So economic migrants will be encouraged to go home.
Migrants and refugees, both of them, are facing violence recently. Some say because the EU and government policy towards them. We've seen arson, we've seen anti-refugee rallies picking up. What can the government do, both Hungarian and other Europeans, to quell this kind of anti-refugee migrant sentiment?
Well, as a matter of fact, in Hungary there hasn't been any such demonstrations. That's much more a German issue. To some extent in other countries where there have been a large number of refugees. The answer is, of course, that Germany and indeed other countries which have taken large numbers of refugees simply can't cope. Public opinion is very uneasy. On the other hand, much of the elite, especially the media elite and the NGO elites, are saying refugees are wonderful. So necessarily you have a conflict, a clash between these two positions. Public opinion, I think, is not very happy that Europe is taking somewhere of the order of 1 to 1.5 million migrants this year. That's a huge number of people to absorb in such a short space of time.
What's the sentiment at the European Parliament about the US taking some responsibility for these refugees? They, of course, are involved in Mideast policy. Refugee statuses are affected by that. Is there a sentiment that the US should take more responsibility, therefore more refugees, or perhaps asylum seekers?
The answer is I don't know. I've not heard anybody say anything about this. Arguably, the United States could take some more refugees, or some refugees, but then why not Brazil? Why not South Africa? Why not China? Why not Russia? It's a global problem. Europe can't solve all the problems of the world.
All right, well, let's leave it at that. Georg Schöpflin, Hungarian MEP with us in the now. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
A black 12-year-old boy was suspended from school in the U.S. for staring at a white girl, his classmate. Here's his story.
12-year-old boy is suspended for staring at a female student.
We really don't understand why the judge ruled the way he did. You know, his statement was that he doesn't feel that he can interfere in school matters. My son said that they were playing a game, she was laughing. I do believe she received pressure from parents, and her going to the principal's office, scared and crying, I think she told them what they wanted to hear. This girl is not shy, she's not timid. In fact, a few days later, she pours milk on someone else's lunch. Her doing a very act of aggression, and the only thing the administration did was talk to her. I'm not saying it's a racial issue. I don't know if it's a gender issue. I don't know if it's a religious issue. I am not sure what the motivation is. I do know, however, that a lot of African-American parents end up pulling their children out.
You've been in the now. Thanks for watching. We'll be on RT every Sunday from now on. Do stay in touch with us online. Send your comments and story ideas to Facebook and Twitter, and I'll see you next week. Till then, it's now or never.